We continue now at the top of Daf Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 9a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara asked, why do we say that if a person slaughters a carbon Pesach shalo lishmo, shalo bizmano, meaning not for the sake of carbon Pesach and not during the time of the carbon Pesach, why do we say that that carbon is always a shlomim? Why don't we say it should be whatever carbon you have in mind for? And so the Gemara now answers, Rabbi Avin says that the answer is, Dochen kodshim hanecholim eitzel kodshim hanecholin, we push kodshim which are eaten, meaning carbon Pesach is a carbon which is eaten, and so we have to make it a carbon which is eaten. Ve'ein dochen kodshim hanecholin eitzel kodshim she'ein hanecholin. We're not going to push off something which is eaten to something which is not eaten, and so therefore the carbon shlomim is eaten, the carbon Pesach is eaten, and that's why again a carbon Pesach shalo lishmo, shalo lizmano is going to turn into a shlomim. But the Gemara asks, atu chatos v'yosham milo misachli, but chatos and osham, aren't they eaten? And the Gemara answers to that, Eladochen kodshim hanecholin l'chol adam, but rather a kodshim which is eaten by all people. The carbon Pesach is eaten by all people, not only kohanim. So we say eitzel kodshim hanecholin l'chol adam. It's pushed into kodshim which are eaten by all people, meaning the carbon shlomim. Ve'ein dochen kodshim hanecholin l'chol adam. We're not going to push off kodshim which are eaten by everyone. Eitzel kodshim she'ein necholin l'chol adam, to kodshim which are not eaten by everyone. And Rashi explains, she'ein necholin l'chol adam ela lezichrei kahuna. These other karbanos, chatas and asham, they're only eaten by male kohanim. We will read the previous Rashi as well. Dochen kodshim hanecholin pesach zeh mitchila huktash l'shem karban hanechol. This carbon Pesach originally was consecrated to be a carbon that's eaten. Hilkach dochen oso eitzel shlomim she'ein necholin v'lo eitzel ola. Therefore we push it to shlomim which is eaten and not to ola. And the Gemara continues with another answer. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Avin says, Dochen kodshim kalam eitzel kodshim kalam. We push kodshim kalam. Carbon Pesach is kodshim kalam, the lighter kind of kodshim, so to speak, to other kodshim kalam, which is shlomim. V'yein dochen kodshim kalam eitzel kodshe kodshim. We don't push off kodshim kalam to kodshe kodshim, and that's why we're not going to say that the carbon Pesach is going to turn into an ola or a chatas or an asham. But the Gemara continues and asks, Maskefla Rav Yitzchak b'Rabbi Savarov. Rabbi Yitzchak b'Rabbi Savarov asks the following question: Ema shachdei l'shem meiser l'havim meiser. Why don't we say that if you slaughter it to be meiser, it would be meiser, because meiser also is kodshim kalim? And Lamai Hilchas said, for what practical difference would that matter? In other words, why would it matter if it's Meiser, talking about Meiser Behema over here, as opposed to Shlomim? The lowly boy Nesachim, it's not going to require Nesachim. Carbon Shlomim requires Nesachim libations. That's not true by Meiser Behema. And another difference is, Ulamilke Olea below Yigoel. Also, there's a lav by Meiser Behema that you're not allowed lo yigol, you're not allowed to sell it, you get malchus for that, so that would also be a nafkamina. So why don't we say that it becomes Meiser Behema if you have in mind for Meiser Behema? And the Gemara says Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says ho asiri yia kodesh, by Meiser Behema it says the 10th animal is holy. Zeh Meiser, and we darshan that this is Meiser Behema v'yein acher Meiser, but something else, meaning let's say carbon Pesach shalo lishmo and shalo bizmano is not going to be Meiser Behema. The Gemara asks along the same lines, Ema shachtei l'shem bechor lahavik bechor. Let's say that if you slaughter it as a bechor, so it should be a bechor. That's also kodshim kalim. And Lamai Hilchas, and again, what practical halachic difference would that make? The lowly boy nesachim, if it's not a shlomim, it's a bechor, it's not going to require nesachim, it won't require libations. Inami deleisve lekohanim, another nafkamina would be that a bechor is given to kohanim, and so again we should say it's a bechor and not shlomim. And the Gemara the Gemara continues and answers, bechor nami evra mi meiser gamar. Bechor can be learned from a gzera shava of evra, and so therefore, since you have a gzera shava, you treat it just like Meiser Behema. Just like Meiser Behema, we say that it's not going to become a Meiser Behema because of the pasuk ha'asiri yeh kodesh zeh Meiser ve'nacher Meiser. So we say the same thing by Bechor. And the Gemara continues, Ve'ema shachtei l'shem tamura. Let's say a person slaughtered it as a tamura. Again, a tamura is an animal that a person tries to take an existing carbon and switch it to another animal. That's tamura, and the halach is that they're both kodesh. And when it comes to tamura, that's actually a violation. You're not allowed to make tamura, but the second animal does become kodesh. So maybe we should say the same thing over here, that if he slaughters it l'shem tamura, l'have tamura, that the carbon Pesach now has the status of a tamura. Again, if it's shalo l'shmo, shalo bizmano, and you're slaughtering it specifically l'shem tmura. And l'mai hilchas, and what practical halachic difference would it make if it's tmura? L'milka la, so first of all you get malchus, because again tmura, it's prohibited to make tmura. Inami, or l'meika maleh below yimocher below yigoel, and they take out this part of the girsa over here because not all tmura is actually under violation of selling it. But in any case, again, why don't we say that it becomes tmura? And the Gemara says, Amar Mar Zutra b'Reid Rav Nachman. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, says, Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, V'hayahu utmuraso. It says it and the animal that you try to exchange for it, and so therefore zu tamura, this animal is a tamura, ve'ein achar tamura. Another animal like Karban Pesach is not going to be tamura. And the Gemara continues and asks, "Ve'emo shachtei l'shem toda lahaviki toda." Why don't we say if you slaughter it as a toda, so then it would be a toda, not a shlamim? And lamai hilchasa, what practical halachic difference would that make? Lahatino lechem, that then bread would be required because lechem is brought along with carbon toda. And the Gemara says to that, "Miika midi de pesach gufe lo boy lechem." Does that make sense to say that there's such a thing that the carbon pesach itself requires no lechem umosaro, but then the leftover carbon pesach, that's what we're referring to here as a carbon pesach, not in its proper zman. That's Mosaro, the leftover Karban Pesach, an animal that was designated as Karban Pesach but not used as Karban Pesach. Boy lechem, that would require bread. That would not make any sense. And the Gemara says, well, if so, if you're going to make that argument, hashtanami, now also you can make the argument against shlamim. Mi'ika midi de pesach gufe lo boy nesachim. Is it possible that Karban Pesach itself doesn't require libations? Umosaro boy nesachim, and the leftover remaining, so to speak, animals of Karban Pesach, they require libations. So that's not a good argument because we know that the most of Karban Pesach is a shlamim. And the Gemara says, Anon hachi ko amrin, and here's what we mean to say when we're rejecting the idea of toda. Mi'ika midi de moser toda atzma. Is there such a situation where even if you had leftover toda, lo boy lechem, that would not require bread? Ve'ilo moser, the asilu me'alma, but you have something extra coming from outside, meaning by Karban Pesach, boy lechem, that would require lechem, that would not make any sense. And Rashi explains, Lahavi Meister, let it be Meister Behema, da Kachim Kalim, who Meister Behema is Kachim Kalim. And Rashi notes, Bechor Meister Ein Tu'unin Nesachim, Bechor and Meister do not require libations, Beperek Shtei Midos, that's a Menachos. But Meister Behema Ksiviyah Kodesh Lo Yigoel, by Meister Behema it says Lo Yigoel. V'darshinan Bebechoros, Beperek Kopsula HaMokdosh, and Dahai Lo Yigoel, Lo Yimachru. Lo Yigoel means that it cannot be sold. Again, that is a lav. And then the Gemara said, Evra, we learn out Bechor from Meister Behema through Gzer Shava of Evra, Bechor ksiv v'havarta kol peta rechem. By Bechor it says v'havarta. Uv'maiser ksiv kol asher yavor tachas hashavet. By Meiser Behema it says yavor. That's the gzeira shavet. Lemilka Allah mishum lo yachalifenu. When it comes to Tamura, there's a lav of lo yachalifenu. Zu Tamura mamisho medis kishichul and eitzel behemas kachim v'hemer. This is going to be Tamura. When you have chulin next to an animal that's kodesh v'hemer, and you try to exchange one animal for the other, who to have it Tamura, that's Tamura. Ve'ein acher zevach rishon sheshachtu l'shem Tamura. Some other carbon is not going to be that you're slaughtering l'shem Tamura. That is not going to be called Tamura. Umosaro boy nesachim, and then the leftover, so to speak, that's going to require libations. To ha'amrit shlamim nehavi, you said let it be shlamim. Why isn't that a problem? Because can it be possible to say that Karban Pesach itself doesn't require nesachim, and the leftover requires nesachim? So obviously we don't make that argument. And so then the Gemara adjusted the argument to moser toda atzma. The leftover toda itself doesn't require lechem. Kagon hifresh todaso v'yavda. That would be, for example, a person separates a carbon toda and loses it. V'hifresh acheres, then separates another animal. V'nimtzas harishona, then finds the first. So ein hashniya tuna lechem. The second one does not require bread. Can amrinim beperek hatoda, like we say in Menachos in perek hatoda. Zevach hatoda toin lechem v'lo valda v'lo tumurasa v'lo chalifasa tu'unin lechem. The toda itself requires bread, but not its offspring, not its tamura, not its exchange. None of those require lechem. And finally, Rashi says, "Umoser da'asil lamialma." If you have moser that comes from outside, meaning toda shabam moser pesach, you're going to have a toda that comes from the moser pesach. Do you think that requires lechem? Of course, that does not require lechem. And we will take a look at two of the Shinuyei Nuschos. First, the Gemara quoted Rav Yitzchak B'Rabbi Sevorov, and in Shinuyei Nuschos, which is other Girsos, it says Nusach Acher Savrin, that it should be Rav Yitzchak B'Rabbi Savrin. And then the Gemara said, Inami L'Meka Maleh B'Lo Yimacher V'Lo Yigal, that Lo Yigal applies to Tmura. We said that some take out that Girsa, and in the Shinuyei Nuschos it says, again, Lessa, you take out this Girsa, V'chein Machko HaRashash. The Rashash also takes it out. Dal Karchach B'Tmuras Shar Karbonos Mayri, because right now we're talking about Tmura of other Karbonos. V'Lo B'Tmuras B'Chor U'Maiser, we're not talking about the Tmura B'Chor Maiser, the Ein Uncraven, which are not offered. Kidel Kamon Daf Lamed Zayin, like we're going to say later on Daf Lamed Zayin. Uv'Tmuras Shar Karbonos, by Tmura of other Karbonos, Lo Kai B'Lo Yimacher. There is no lav of Lo Yimacher, and that's why we take out that line in the Gemara. And the Gemara continues, Maskefla Rav Yemar Bereder Rav Hillel. Rav Yemar, the son of Rav Hillel, asks the following question: Umimai dever Moser Pesach Ksiv. How do we know that the pasuk of V'im min hatson karbono lezevach shlamim, which we're interpreting as meaning that if the person brings the carbon Pesach not in its proper time, it becomes a shlamim? How do we know that's talking about Moser Pesach? Dilma b'Moser Asham Ksiv. Maybe that pasuk is talking about a carbon Asham that's not being brought as an Asham. How do you know it's talking about a carbon Pesach? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava says, Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, V'im min hatzon karbono lezevach shlamim, and we learn from that, Davar hashave b'chol hatzon. It has to be something equal across all tzon, across all sheep. And Rashi explains, Dilma b'Moser Asham Ksiv. Maybe we're not talking about Moser Pesach, we're talking about Moser Asham. Hai v'im min hatzon, meaning when the pasuk says v'im min hatzon, from the sheep, which we assume means carbon Pesach, that's not being brought as a carbon Pesach, that is not bismano, again what we call Moser Pesach, maybe it's talking about Asham. The Asham nami el tamim min hatzonu, because Asham also is a ram from tzon, that's from sheep. V'eno ba min habakar, it does not come from cattle, it comes from tzon. So maybe the pasuk is talking about Asham. And the Gemara answered b'chol tzon. It has to be something that applies to all sheep, meaning b'kvasim v'izim, meaning a carbon Pesach is brought from sheep and from goats. That is all included in the word tzon. Kagon Pesach, that would be, for example, again, carbon Pesach. La'afuke Asham, that would exclude a carbon Asham. De'eno ba min ha'izim, that does not come from goats, it only comes from kvasim. An ayil is a ram, that's a male sheep, and so therefore, again, it doesn't come from izim, and that's why we assume the pasuk is talking about Moser Pesach. And the Gemara continues, Maskefla Rav Avin Bar Chia. Rav Avin Bar Chia asks the following question. V'itay, some say it's Rav Avin Bar Kahana, that Rav Avin Bar Kahana asks the question, B'chol asar, in all places, at amrit min lahotzi. The word min is lahotzi, it's an exclusion. V'kan min larabos, and here you're using min as an inclusion, meaning we're saying that when it says v'im min hatzon, what it means is b'chol tzon. It's talking about all sheep. That sounds like an inclusion. That does not sound like an exclusion. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Imani says, Hachanami min lahotzi. Here also, the min actually is an exclusion. To loasi ben shtei shanim, because by carbon Pesach, you can't bring it when it's 2 years old. V'loasi ben a kaven, you cannot bring it as a female, and so there is something excluded from this word min. And Rashi explains, B'chol asar at amar, b'chol mokam at omer, in all places you say min lahotzihu, that the word min is an exclusion. Kagon min habehema, like it says min habehema lahotzi roveya v'nirba, that excludes roveya and nirba. Min habakar lahotzi as nevad, it says min habakar to exclude nevad. Min hatzon lahotzi as muksa, it says min hatzon to exclude muksa. V'kan ata omer min l'rabos, here the min is an inclusion. To ko'amrit min hatzon pesach mashma shabab mikol tzon, because you're saying min hatzon is carbon Pesach, because it comes from all sheep. And the Gemara answered, Hachanami, here also, Ki mukminon love Pesach min lahotziu. Even when we're saying it's carbon Pesach, we're really saying it is an exclusion. To loasi ben shtei shanim v'loasi nekeva. You can't bring carbon Pesach from an animal 2 years old. You can't bring it from a female. In other words, it cannot be older than 1 year old, and it cannot be from a female. Umiu hatzon mikol min son mashma. But nevertheless, the word hatzon is all species of sheep. Bein kevasim, bein izim, whether we're talking about sheep or goats, anything that counts as tzon. Umiyuta demin l'nekevos asa, and the exclusion of min, that is excluding nekevos. And the Gemara continues, Maskefla Rav Chana Bagadator. Rav Chana from Baghdad asked the following question, Umi motzes amr, can you really say, Dechi ksiv hai b'moser pesach ksiv, that again, this pasuk of v'im min hatzon karbono lezevach shlamim is talking about moser pesach, v'hamidech ksiv, but from the fact that it's written in the pasuk im kesev, it says im kesev, and it says v'im eis, it says if it's a sheep, if it's a goat, michlal delav b'moser pesach ksiv, that implies that we're not talking about moser pesach. We'll see Rashi in a moment why those words in the pasuk would not be necessary if we're talking about Moser Pesach, but in any case, it doesn't seem we're talking about Moser Pesach from the fact that it includes Im Kesev and V'imeis, which are not really necessary to teach by Moser Pesach. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ahumi boy le'lechidetanya. Those words, when it says Im Kesev, when it says V'imeis, those are needed for what's taught in the following brisa. When it says Kesev, when it says sheep, l'rabos hasa Pesach la'aliyah, that includes by Korban Pesach that you also have to offer the aliyah, which is the tail. Kishu omer Im Kesev, and when it says Im Kesev, l'rabos Pesach she'ivra shenasa, that comes to include also a Korban Pesach where the year has already passed, it's older than a year old, u'shlamim haboy machmas Pesach, and also a Korban Shlamim that's coming because of a Korban Pesach, we're including that l'chol mitzvah shlamim, for all mitzvahs of shlamim, meaning sheyitanu smicha u'nesachim u'tenufas chazav v'shok, that it requires smicha, leaning upon the animal, nesachim, libations, and the waving of the breast and the thigh. And the Brisa continues, Kishuomer v'imeis, and when it says v'imeis, hifsika inyan, that's like a separation. Limed alo'ez, that teaches about the goat, she'ena tu'na aliyah, that the tail is not required. And Rashi explains, from the fact that it says im kesev and imeis, that sounds like we're not talking about Moser HaPesach. Ela b'shlamim gredi. What the Gemara is asking is that implies we're talking about a regular carbon shlamim. And this is what the pasuk is saying: Im neder lohavi min hatzon. If a person makes a neder to bring from sheep, yavi eza sheyirtze, so he can bring either one that he wants. O keves oez, he can either bring a sheep or he can bring a goat. The ibn Moser HaPesach, because if the pasuk is actually talking about Moser HaPesach, again an animal that was designated as a carbon Pesach and then ended up not being used as a carbon Pesach, it's being used not in its proper time, and that the pasuk is teaching us that that's a shlamim. If that's the case, lam aliyim keves imeis. What does the pasuk have to say if you choose a sheep, if you choose a goat? Everybody knows, it's obvious that a carbon Pesach comes from sheep and goats, because that's actually what it says in the parsha of carbon Pesach. It says min hakvasim min ha'izim, and so therefore that line in the pasuk indicates we're talking about shlamim. And Rashi continues, L'chidatanya, when it says in the pasuk im keves v'yameis, that's actually for what's taught in the Brisa, and what it means is l'chalik beineim, number one, to make a distinction between the two of them, and also u'lefarish el chosein, and also to explain their halachas. Lomar, to say keves ton al yolam mizbeach, that the keves, the tail, needs to be offered on the mizbeach. V'ha'ez, and when it comes to the goat, ein al yaso b'chlal emurim, the tail of the goat is not part of what is offered on the mizbeach. Keves kro yiseru, the word keves is an extra word in the pasuk. Since it says min hatzon, and then it says if it's a goat, so that implies that until now we're talking about a sheep. Because from tzon, when we say the word tzon, it's only going to mean sheep and goats, and so that word is an extra word. And again, the Gemara said la'aliyah, that we're talking about an aliyah, which is a tail, shatei kreva ime murin, and we're saying that the aliyah by the keves needs to be brought together with what's brought on the mizbeach, kineged hakloyos ulamata. Now that's anywhere from the area of the kidneys, opposite the kidneys and below. What Rashi is saying is it really starts a little above the tail. It says l'umas ha'otze, and we learn that to mean makom sha'kloyos yoatzos. That's the area where the kidneys are, the kidneys advise, so to speak, and so it's the area of the tail all the way starting from that area, keneged hakloyos, that has to be offered. And then the Brisa said that when it comes to shlamim haboin machmas pesach, shlamim that are being brought because of carbon pesach, so they have to require smicha, nesachim, tenufas, chazav, v'shok. Now that's referring to chagigas arba aser. That's referring to the carbon chagiga that's brought on the 14th. That's the shlamim haboim machmas pesach. And again, when Rashi refers to lechalik beineim, to make a difference between the sheep and the A's, so that's what the Gemara said later, what the Brisa said later, that limed al ha'ez she'ena tu'na aliyah, that the A's, unlike the kesev, the A's does not require the offering of the tail. And the Gemara continues, V'hamei hacha nafka, is that learned out from over here, midiavua de Shmuel nafka, it's actually learned out from the statement of the father of Shmuel, which we had earlier. And Rashi explains the question, V'hamei hacha nafka, is that really learned out from over here? The Pesach she'avra shenaso, this is talking about a carbon Pesach that's more than a year old, karev shlamim, so that's brought as a shlamim. V'halo zehu Moser HaPesach, isn't that the same thing as Moser HaPesach, as leftover carbon Pesach, so to speak? V'hayolafta lo le'el midavu de Shmuel, where do you learn that out? From what the father of Shmuel said. In other words, the Gemara here is asking on the statement in the Brisa. The Brisa said, Kishuomer im keves lerabos Pesach she'ivra shenasa. When it says in the pasuk im keves, it includes a carbon Pesach that's more than a year old. Ushlamim haboy machmas pech, and a shlamim that come because of Pesach, which Rashi said was the chagigas arba aser, and that comes to include that they have l'chol mitzvah shlamim, that they follow all the rules of shlamim, sheyatanu smicha nesachim utenufas chazav v'shok. Again, that they require smicha, leaning upon the animal, nesachim, which is libations, and tenufas chazav v'shok, which is the waving of the breast and the thigh. And so therefore, do we really need to learn this out from the pasuk im keves? It was really already taught by the father of Shmuel earlier. And the Gemara now brings that statement from the father of Shmuel, the Yamar Avu de Shmuel, because the father of Shmuel said, V'yim min hatzon karbano lezevach shlamim. The pasuk says, if you're going to bring from tzon the carbon lezevach shlamim, and we understand that to mean davar haba min hatzon yehei lezevach shlamim, something that comes from tzon, meaning carbon Pesach, is going to be a carbon shlamim. And so therefore that was really the source for this idea idea of Moser Pesach is going to be Shlamim. And so what exactly is the Brisa teaching us? And the Gemara continues, Vakati, and still, we actually have another source that we quoted earlier. Midir Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua, because it really can also be learned from Rav Nachman, from Rabba bar Avua. The Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Minayin lemoser Pesach, how do we know that Moser Pesach, the extra from Karban Pesach, the remaining animals, Shekariv Shlamim, that they're brought as Shlamim, Shenemar, that it says in the Pasuk, and there's a different Pasuk. It says, V'zavachta Pesach la'Hashem elokecha tzon ubakar. It says you're going to bring the Pesach to Hashem tzon ubakar. And the question is, V'aloin Pesach ba, element hakavosim u'menoizim, but really the Karban Pesach is just brought from sheep and goats. So what does it mean that it's tzon ubakar? And so the Gemara, So Rabba bar Avua said that the answer is Elamikan lemoser haPesach. What this pasuk is actually teaching is that Moser haPesach sheyehei ledavar haba min hatzonam and habakar, that is used for something which comes from tzon and bakar, referring to Karban Shlamim. So that's really the source, that Moser haPesach is for Karban Shlamim. Umayni Shlamim. What is something that comes from tzon ubakar? That's Shlamim. And this we said earlier. Rashi here says it again. Umayni Shlamim deboin mikol tzon ubakar, because Shlamim can come from all tzon and bakar. Bein whether male or female. And so now we have three sources for essentially the same thing. And so the Gemara says, Ela Tulasa Kroiksiv. Rather, there are three psukim that are written for this issue, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tes Amud Beis.